Well, hello, everyone. My name is Monica Lewis, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the engagement manager at SMU DataArts. I'm going to provide my physical description. I'm a cisgendered African American woman in my mid-30s. I'm wearing a gray button-up blouse and a sage sweater. My hair is natural. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses, and there's a white background behind me. On behalf of our team and partners at Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, we would like to extend our sincere thanks for joining us for today's session, Navigating Recovery, Arts and Cultural Financial Operating Trends in Chicago. Before I introduce our amazing presenters for SMU DataArts and Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, I do want to take this moment to pause and reflect to honor the lands and its stewards. While we come today on a virtual platform, we do take this moment to acknowledge the significance of the lands that we all call home. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all First Nations people. Chicago is traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi nations, and many other tribes like the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, and Sac, and Fox also call this area home. Located at the intersection of several great waterways, the land naturally becomes a site of travel and healing for many tribes. American Indians continue to call this area home, and now Chicago is home to the third largest urban American Indian community that still practices their heritage, traditions, and care for the land and waterways. At SMU DataArts, we also take this moment to acknowledge the Apache, Caddo, Comanche, Cushata, Tonkawa, the Wichita and affiliated Kichi, Waco, Taiwakoni, and Lenni Lenape peoples, past and present, upon whose traditional territories SMU DataArts now exist. My team will be sharing a link to a map if you would like to learn more about the Indigenous communities near where you called home. And we also encourage you to share your own local land acknowledgements if you would like. Now, quickly for a bit of housekeeping, we are recording today's webinar, and we will be sure to share that recording with you in a follow-up email. But we will ask that you remain on mute, and that is just to ensure the best sound quality as our presenters share amazing data. If you have any questions about today's content, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature that you'll find on your Zoom dashboard. Feel free to share questions at any point. Our team in the background will be happy to help you and direct you with some additional resources. I will note that we have an exceptionally large crowd today, so it is quite possible that we may not get to each and every question, and that's okay. We will work very hard to provide you with insights to those questions. And we encourage you to utilize the chat feature. That's there for you to share any comments or responses to any of our chat questions, and to reach out to our team to help you troubleshoot any technology issues that you may be experiencing. And finally, we do have closed captioning available. Please find the CC icon on your Zoom dashboard where you can activate closed captioning as you need it. If you need any assistance with these measures, please let us know via the chat feature. We'd be happy to assist you. And just to say it again, we are recording today's presentation and we'll be sharing that with you. Now, as I switch into gears to introduce our amazing panelists, I want to quickly share a little bit about SMU DataArts. And our mission is to empower and provide and engage organizations and individuals with evidence-based insights needed to collectively build strong, vibrant, and equitable communities. We employ cutting-edge research techniques and high-powered computing to test hypotheses, build theory, and increase understanding of the arts and cultural sector. And I'm excited that today is one of those great examples of that work in action. And so let me introduce some of the amazing people that will be talking about our topic today. First, we have Dr. Zannie Voss, who is the director of SMU DataArts, the National Center for Arts Research, and the professor of arts management at SMU Meadows School of Arts and the Cox School of Business. Zannie has published articles examining the strategic factors that influence organizational performance in leading academic journals and marketing and management. We also have Jamey Lundblad, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Marketing and Development at DCASE. For more than 10 years, Jamey has served as the department's chief External Affairs Officer, currently overseeing communications, design, and partnerships. And we also have Erin Harkey, who is the Commissioner of the City of Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. Erin was appointed to the post in November of 2021, having served the City of Chicago since 2016. Erin holds 20 years of experience working in the nonprofit and government sector, helping individuals and communities succeed through the arts. With that, I'm excited to welcome to our proverbial stage, Commissioner Erin Harkey. Commissioner, we're excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Monica. It's great to be here. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We're really excited about the interest that this report has generated, and we hope that this information can be helpful to you in whatever community that you're in. I also want to just extend our thanks to the team at SMU DataArts. They have been extraordinary partners. I also want to extend my heartfelt thanks to the DCASE team, in particular our grants, communication, and special projects teams who were instrumental in helping to get this report out. We started this conversation with SMU DataArts early this year. And we felt like it was important to do a little bit of a temperature check on the health of the sector after what we all know was a sort of devastating blow dealt by COVID. We were also hearing from our colleagues, particularly in the theater sector, that they were worried that audiences were not returning and that the relief dollars that had sustained them during and after the pandemic were starting to run out. So what the data kind of told us was something that we all kind of knew and anticipated, but it's helped us confirm and I think contextualize what's happening and sort of communicate to people that the information that we were seeing in the media about contractions within the theater sector, reduction of performances and layoffs was not a fluke just happening to some theaters, but really was a sort of system-wide challenge. The media in Chicago has been, I think, a good partner in this effort. Once we released the data, it was picked up by numerous outlets that have helped us communicate, I think, the messaging about what's happening in the arts and culture sector to the public. A lot of the narrative has kind of focused around, kind of a doom and gloom crisis in the arts narrative. But really, we feel like this is a positive moment, right? To both understand what's happening and to use that information to help us better inform what strategic sort of next steps might be. The other thing that I think has not gotten the attention that it deserves is some positive news, right, about what's happening to our small and BIPOC-led institutions. And I think Zannie is going to go a little bit more into depth with that later. But there's some positive things that I think we need to pay attention to, both in terms of individual contributions being increased at BIPOC organizations and helping to sustain more of their operating revenue over time, and also the sort of growth of these organizations and the fact that they have been able to add both part-time and full-time employees. All of that is positive news, right? And we need to, in the sort of midst of understanding next steps, also continue to support and grow that which is encouraging in our sector. I'd like to say also that this data has helped us really galvanize support amongst our elected officials. Our mayor, Brandon Johnson, has been an excellent ally. We were able to sit down with him and a group of theater leaders not too long ago, where he was available to kind of hear directly from them what the challenges and opportunities are. So it has been a powerful sort of advocacy tool for us within government as we think about strategically directing the resources that we have available here in the city. I also want to say that the data has been really great in helping to catalyze partnerships with other organizations, namely the League of Chicago Theaters, which is the service organization for theaters here in Chicago, It's also helped to catalyze our relationships with other funders and private philanthropy. And we're excited about, what potential collaborations between organizations and philanthropy might mean in terms of identifying funding and resources to be able to propel solutions. In the next couple of months, we're going to be convening a series of work groups with theater leaders to help tease out potential solutions around a variety of things, including increasing access to corporate and private dollars, finding ways to improve audience engagement, expand our audiences. We're going to also continue our data work with SMU DataArts to understand a little bit more about audience demographics and audience behavior. Our kind of foray into data is new for this agency, but it feels really, really good and really natural for us to be able to kind of step into this space and to provide this sort of critical and needed information for, again, our elected officials, our folks within government, but also arm the field so that they can also advocate for additional resources in the communities that they're in. So again, I just want to thank you all for being here. We'll be available for questions after the presentation, and you'll also have a chance to meet and speak to my colleague, Jamey Lundblad, who will tell you a little bit more about the marketing and communication stuff that we're up to as well. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Zannie Voss, Director of SMU DataArts.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Harkey, and hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out to join us today. When we started this project in early 2023, there were a lot of people in the arts field who anticipated kind of a quick return to better days, as exemplified in this quote. We're planning a return during COVID, thought it was going to come back to what it was. It never will be back to what it was. Just the sense of anticipation of how do we handle all of the turbulence in the environment now. And so I want to kind of get us all in a headspace of thinking about what's going on. And so I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind using the chat just to share, because I know you're not here just to listen to us, but this is a community of folks in Chicago who are interested in these findings and understanding what was context pre-reopening and moving forward. So in the chat, who here has totally moved on from the pandemic? Type me if it's me, and then who's still feeling some of the lingering effects from the pandemic, either in the personal life or in your professional life? Have things changed? Have you changed any habits that you had with respect to going out? Whether you started doing something new, developed a new habit, whether you dropped or stopped something that you used to do with regularity, or maybe you just don't go out as frequently. We're feeling it in our own lives, and it's a similar thing to what I think people writ large are feeling within communities. And so as much as we all really do want COVID to be a thing of the past, we're going to continue to feel some of the ripple effects of change for years to come. For some, things have never looked better, so that change has meant something positive. Others are struggling, especially when factors like high inflation are at play. I'm going to start just by setting some of the context. We looked at 4 sources of data for 4 years and analyzed it in 4 ways. So to start with, I really want to say a huge and sincere thank you to those of you here who have invested your time and your effort in sharing your organization's data with DCASE. These findings are yours. We put together kind of a data puzzle, and that meant integration of each single organization's available data from these numerous sources for the years 2019 through 2022 and kind of piecing it all together. And we followed a process of progression from the source with the most information on organizations to the source with the least. So if an organization had CDP data or cultural data profile data, each year of 2019 through 2022, we used it. If there was no CDP data for 2019 or 2022, we pulled in the CARP data that was collected in April of this year. And if an organization had neither the CDP nor the CARP data, then we pulled in City Arts data when it was available, or IRS 990 data. So within each trend, we followed the same set of organizations over time. Between trends, the number in the cohort varies with the availability of data that we had about that particular activity. So most of these analyses and these trends are going to include between 50 and 90 organizations, but some follow over 300. It really just depends. And when I say we analyzed the data in 4 ways, we looked overall, kind of all of the organizations pulled together. We looked by organization size, small, medium, and large, and these budget cutoffs that you see were really just determined by attempting to create groups of roughly equal size in the data. Third, we looked by arts and cultural sector. So dividing organizations into unique disciplines, it kind of created a lot of categories, but none of which had a lot of respondents, enough to be representative. So we kind of grouped organizations into performing arts, museums, and all other, which includes community-based organizations, arts education, media organizations, and others. And then mission-focused population, where organizations self-select as being by, for, or about a specific population. Again, dividing organizations into the many unique groups represented in organizational missions created too many categories with too few respondents. So we made 3 groups. Those who are by, for, and about Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Those who are led by, for, or about any of the following populations: LGBTQIA+, children, youth, older adults, women, currently or formerly incarcerated individuals, individuals with disabilities, military veterans, et cetera. And then general, so those organizations who don't self-identify as having a mission focused on a specific population. Of course, organizations possess a wide constellation of traits. They're not just small or just performing arts. Although generally speaking, we do see kind of trends that happen. Generally speaking, museums tend to have larger budgets than either performing arts or other arts organizations. BIPOC-centered organizations and those whose mission focuses on other constituencies tend to have smaller budgets than their general public surveying counterparts. And we present averages. Again, not all organizations with similar traits experience these trends. There are those who vary considerably and may be bucking trends. So now let's dive into some of the findings. And I'm going to encourage you to please share your findings in the chat. Post when it's your organization that is bucking the trend, share with folks what you're doing differently, or just post when you feel like the findings kind of validate your own experience. So first, shrinking budgets increase costs. And not surprisingly, budgets shrank. That pre-recession march of growth in total expenditures in the arts kind of came to a halt. Our data show that the average Chicago arts and cultural organization shed over a third, or 37% of its budget from 2019 to 2021, which was kind of in the depth of the pandemic. By comparison, though, the US economy shrank only 19% over the same period. So the impact of COVID on arts organizations was double that of the overall intensity on the economy more generally. There was a big rebound in 2022 as doors reopened. The average Chicago organization's total expenses were 8% lower in 2019 than in 2022 than in 19 in nominal dollars. But because every dollar had less buying power over time, the impact of that real change was an average budget that was actually 20% lower 3 years later. Performing arts organizations underwent the greatest reduction in total expenses, followed by museums at 13%. Performing arts organizations had a 20% cut. Now, I mentioned this idea of real change. Inflation has a very real impact on the cost of producing, presenting, exhibiting art, offering education programs, and operating organizations. Those of you here know that intimately and well. This means that organizations need to bring in more income over time just to keep up. So what cost $100 back in December of 2019 cost $115 in December of 2022. And so for this reason, the financial growth figures reflect a 15% adjustment for inflation throughout all of these analyses. And when you think of, so where did the organizations cut expenses? In Chicago arts organizations, as in the field more generally, budget reductions were mainly achieved through cuts to programs, cuts to programmatic offerings. In the organizations studied in Chicago, there were nearly 2/3 fewer programs in 2022 than in 2019. National news in the summer of 2023 highlights more of the same, especially among theaters. There were much publicized decisions, for example, by the Public Theater to cease its Under the Radar Festival, the cancellation of the Humana Festival of New American Plays at Actors Theater of Louisville. It's not unique to Chicago. Overall, the arts workforce is mostly back in Chicago. The organization studied reduced staff during the pandemic, but reinstated all but 10% of employees in 2022, with the elimination of 2 full-time positions per organization. And this is looking at the overall average. This kind of mid-pandemic dip, it resonates with some findings that some of you may have heard today from AFTA in the Arts and Economic Prosperity 6 report findings that just came out. Today, they cited a 2021 Johns Hopkins reports saying that the arts lost 5 times more jobs than other nonprofit sectors. That's really stark. If we break down findings by organization size, though, we see kind of a different story. We see that this employment trend was driven really by large organizations. In fact, small and medium budget organizations slightly increased their average staff size. And if we slice the data instead by mission focus, we see that BIPOC organizations and organizations that are by, for, and about other constituencies actually added full-time and part-time staff. So in both cases, they really bucked the trend. I want to note that despite budget cuts, arts and cultural organizations remain committed to artists across all budget sizes, across all arts sectors. Chicago organizations hired more artists over this period. BIPOC organizations stood out in their commitment to hiring artists, increasing their artistic pool by more than 80% over the 4-year period. A finding, dwindling audiences. In-person attendance at these Chicago organizations naturally slowed to a trickle during the pandemic. With closures, doors were closed. It did recover somewhat in 2022, but it was still 60% lower overall than it was pre-pandemic by December of 2022. The fact that 15 Chicago organizations reported in-person attendance in excess of 200,000 back in 2019, whereas only 1 organization exceeded 200,000 attendees in 2022. It really underscores kind of the pervasiveness of attendee losses. And you're likely saying, okay, Zannie, but that was back then. That was back in 2022. What about now? We're in the second half of 2023. Haven't audiences come back? Overall, the answer is yes, somewhat, but really slowly. Our partners at TRG Arts recently released an update on the recovery status of U.S. ticket sales through August of 2023. And compared to 2019 for the same period, 2023 ticket sales were down 20%. And ticket revenue was still down 3%. And as they say in the report, August saw a continuation of the previous month's weak ticket sales and revenue. They're seeing a plateauing rather than growth overall. So know that when revenue losses are actually less than the loss in the number of sales, it means that the organizations are probably charging higher ticket prices just to be able to keep finances in line. In terms of revenue, naturally, these attendance trends had serious implications for finances. Total earned revenue plummeted while doors were closed to in-person programming. It actually shrank 82% to 2019 to 2021. It's recovered substantially. Still, it was 33% below 2019 levels after adjusting for inflation, and it covered 6% less of total expenses over time. This trend holds regardless of budget size, regardless of whether organizations focus their mission on a particular population or not. The lion's share of earned revenue is from ticket sales, admissions fees, tuition for educational programs, and the like, or what we call program revenue. And at the end of 22, this main source of earned revenue was 46% lower, despite nearly tripling from 2021 to 2022. So the rebound is there, it's just not back to pre-pandemic levels. It also accounted for less of total earned revenue over time. It comprised 60% of earned revenue in 2019 and was 46% of earned revenue in 2022. For some organizations with exceptional pandemic era activity, other sources of earned revenue partially made up for program revenue losses, particularly in 2020 and 2021. So COVID was a major factor in the attendance drop-off, but in many ways, it intensified declining trends that existed pre-pandemic. Historically, subscribers and members have been a substantial presence among in-person attendees. These folks represent a base of loyal patrons who provide security, upfront cash, fill capacity throughout the year. They require less to market to per dollar they bring in. And the pandemic, though, really exacerbated the ongoing trend of declines in relational customers in both the performing arts as well as the museum sectors. I'm sharing with you a slide that shows an example from theaters from another study. And you can see here that over the past 20 years, theater subscription sales nationally were at their highest back in 2005. They dropped substantially during the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009. They've continued on a downward slide thereafter. Nevertheless, subscribers still feel nearly a quarter of available theater seats on average nationally heading into the pandemic. So it's important to say, okay, of this still important base, what's happened? Skip to the period of this study from 2019 to 2022 and what happened in Chicago. Well, Chicago performing arts organizations and museums in the study saw respectively 26% and 29% further declines in the number of subscribers and members, kind of reflecting national trends. For Chicago theaters in particular, the 4-year drop in the number of subscribers averaged 39%. In addition to number of subscribers, if we look across all art sectors in Chicago, subscriber and member revenue, the dollars that go with it, were 61% lower the 4-year period. And for the subset of theaters, that drop in 4-year subscription revenue was 65%. So the trends were there. COVID accelerated them, but we've seen a few more changes come in line that are complicating factors to COVID. The differences in attendance and trends, if we take a look at those, we see some clues as to what's going on. So here we're seeing average in-person and total attendance by arts and cultural sector. In-person attendance decreases for the performing arts were a decrease of 59% over the 4-year change. For other arts and cultural organizations, it was 73%. And in-person, though, for museums was only 14% in the Chicago organization studied. Generally speaking, museums were able to open their doors sooner than performing arts or other kinds of arts organizations, given their advantage of flexible entry times, ability to control the flow of people, relatively low interaction between visitors and both staff and artists, frequent ability of outdoor spaces that help people to have freedom of movement, natural airflow. And there are a lot of other studies right now that are emerging that confirm that the earlier organizations could resume their in-person activity, the sooner their attendees and associated revenue returned. There's testimony to that effect regarding even positive performance from theaters that were able to get back and engage people through programming sooner. And yet there are other factors that are affecting attendance that are driven by changes in consumer behavior. And I'd like to highlight, this is a quote from Meslansky and partners. We now live in an age with multiple truths, but only one truth matters, their truth. In order to break through and connect with your target, you have to communicate to their truth, not to your truth. It really hits home about the fact that adaptive capabilities at this time in history are really, really critical because people have settled into new preferences and arts engagement behaviors. It's just a reality. Another complicating factor is a lack of flexibility in operating models, particularly in the performing arts, that kind of runs contrary to a lot of the way that a lot of people are now consuming in the rest of their daily lives. Live performance attendance, it requires that people are able to come at the curtain time, not just whenever it's convenient for them to come. There's kind of a penalty to coming late, and coming and going as you want disrupts the experience for other people near you. You can't eat at your seat. These are all behaviors that people have come accustomed to. And perhaps more importantly, many people developed new interests and habits while performing arts organizations' doors were closed. Netflix, other forms of streamed entertainment emerged as a desirable substitute. It's apparent that the in-person attendance experience no longer holds quite the same lure for as many people as it once did. Now it's a question of how do you rebuild some of those audience going habits, particularly within the performing arts? How do new people come on board? Another kind of change that's happened is, just a quote, I average 5 hours, 25 minutes per day on my mobile phone, and I check it 58 times per day. This is, just facts coming from TED Jury in July of 2023. The average person checks their phone 58 times a day. Either give me a really compelling reason to forget my phone or let me use it. Putting down a phone, putting down digital devices, stepping out from behind them is increasingly perceived as a high price to pay to engage with arts and cultural organizations in person. People feel shortchanged if they can't photograph or film their experiences to share on social media. And if they can't do this with arts and cultural organizations, they're going to do it without them. So just keeping in mind, considering how your arts and cultural organization is figuring out how to meet people where they consume and how they consume. Let's move on and talk about contributed revenue. Private donation growth lagged inflation. In private giving by trustees, other individual foundations supported the same level of expenses for Chicago organizations in 2022 as in both 2019 and 2020, with basically just a 1% change in either direction. It's important to keep in mind that expense levels were lower in 2022, so the same percentage of expenses over time simply means that either growth in private giving was either not sufficient in terms of change relative to expenses, as was the case in trustee support, where it was higher, but the relationship to expenses didn't precipitate more than a 1% shift. Or it means that the private donations failed to keep pace with inflation, as well as was the case with other individual support and foundation support. If we sum up the contributions to trustees, other individuals, and foundations, that figure is 14% lower considering inflation. During 2021, if you look at 2021 data for trustee support, trustees stepped up their support. The average Chicago organization's trustee support more than tripled that year and covered 18% more of expenses than 4 to 6% as it was in other years, including 2022, which really that 4 to 6% falls in line with the average percent of expenses covered with trustee support kind of across the board. We know that large organizations really drove that trend. They experienced growth in trustee giving, whereas that of small organizations was actually a 3% loss in the amount of expenses supported by trustee giving from 2019 to 2022. Overall, individual giving was fairly flat. It only changed by 2%. So the growth in this area clearly did not keep pace with inflation. And it's easy to understand how individuals, your individual donors, who themselves are confronting the effects of inflation in their own personal spending, may not think twice about the fact that they gave $100 back in 2019. They're going to give $100 again this year without thinking that that $100 doesn't go as far for the organization as it did before. Again, that report that I mentioned from our friends at TRG Arts, it showed that individual giving was down in August of 2023 relative to 2019. It says that there were actually 10% fewer gifts from individual donors and 34% less revenue from individual donors. If you look at the report, it appears that the 2023 individual revenue peaked actually back in April and has been on the decline ever since. Bucking the trend, as Commissioner Harkey had mentioned, BIPOC organizations buck both of the individual giving trends. For trustees, their trustee support was actually 14% lower. However, they had a 46% increase in support from other individuals over time. That's really a remarkable increase, and it's a testament to the compelling sense of relevance that a lot of these organizations hold for the communities that they serve at a time of need. On average, overall, total foundation support diminished by 21% over time. Again, there are some notable differences by budget size and by mission-focused population. Large organizations actually average a 27% decrease in foundation support. Medium-sized organizations, a 17% decrease. Small organizations buck the trend with 59% growth in foundation support. BIPOC organizations increase foundation funding, but not enough to keep pace with inflation, whereas organizations that are by, for, or about other constituencies and those serving the general population respectively saw declines of 37% and 62%, respectively, in foundation giving. Government support proved essential. Despite the fact that private overall support was lower over time, total contributed revenue growth was actually outpacing inflation by 26% by the end of 2022. And this was largely driven by government support. It proved essential. It supported an increasing level of the average organization's expenses over the past 4 years, growing from supporting 4% of expenses all the way up to 12% of expenses. Federal relief programs kept many organizations afloat during the pandemic and saved jobs in the arts, fulfilling its intended purposes. And if we kind of look a little bit deeper, we see that large and particularly performing arts organizations benefited most from exceptional government relief. And that's both through particularly the Small Business Administration's Payroll Protection Program, but especially the Shuttered Venues Operating Grant that was also administered by the SBA. The vast majority, as we all know, of federal relief dollars that buoyed a lot of organizations during the years of the pandemic crisis have now run out. The duration of relief funding hasn't matched the slower build and return experienced by most arts and cultural organizations, particularly theaters. It's a timing issue. The recovery is still in process and the relief is no longer there. Let's look at working capital. Chicago organizations in this study, they experience positive working capital every year. One can think of working capital in terms of months. So how long could an organization pay its short-term obligations if it had to survive on current resources? Overall, average months of working capital were slightly lower in 2022 than in 2019. A really different story emerges, though, when we look at results for organizations of different budget size and different primary communities served. Large organizations drove the 2022 decrease that's reflected in the trends for organizations overall. It's driven by mounting short-term obligations to others like banks, vendors, employees. By contrast, small organizations increased their level of working capital by 40% over time, and medium organizations by 20%. BIPOC organizations and those of, by, and for another unique community had growth in working capital over time, while those serving the general public had less. These trends are actually not out of the ordinary. For example, prior research shows that BIPOC and small organizations actually tend to have higher working capital than their non-BIPOC or larger peers. They tend to have lower fixed costs, so they're more nimble. They tend to have less access to capital, like bank loans, so they have to have working capital and cash on hand, and they have to be self-reliant in order for that to happen. On our website, you're going to find links to many of the reports that I referenced during the presentation. I encourage you to check them out, as well as our research reports more broadly, which fall under these 4 major areas of research. Now, the trends seen in Chicago are really kind of a microcosm of the trends experienced elsewhere. We all know that the final story on 2023 remains unwritten. Time is going to tell whether or not the resiliency experienced by arts and cultural organizations in the wake of previous crises will prevail. It's just a matter of time. There have been predictions about the end of American theater over the last 50 years, and to date, they've not materialized. So while many are facing headwinds, there are many organizations that are thriving. There are theaters here in Chicago that are thriving. And I want to say that it's been a real pleasure to work with the DCASE team on this project. A huge thank you to Commissioner Harkey, to Tara, to Kalina, the entire staff for being such wonderful partners. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jamey Lundblad, DCASE's Deputy Commissioner for Marketing and Development, who's going to talk about theater marketing strategies and resources. Jamey?
Thank you, Zannie. Good afternoon, everyone. Great. So thanks again. Good afternoon. As you've heard, theater in Chicago was the hardest hit and slowest to recover among the performing arts sectors. So I'm going to very briefly share some updates with you about our recent theater marketing strategies. For context, since well before the pandemic, DCASE has, of course, been celebrating and supporting Chicago's performing arts industry. 2019 was the year of Chicago theater, followed by the years of Chicago music in both 2020 and 2021, and the year of Chicago dance in 2022. In response to the global pandemic, DCASE has provided hundreds of GenOp grants to nonprofit arts organizations throughout Chicago. We've offered theater, dance, and music residencies and other performance opportunities. We've created a directory of creative worker resources, from job boards to professional advancement programs to emergency funding. We've assembled a list of City of Chicago marketing assets available to arts organizations in our city. And we've convened the industry to learn, listen, and respond. In fact, as Commissioner Harkey mentioned, Mayor Johnson recently hosted a listening session with members of the theater community to talk about their particular challenges and bright spots, which served as a springboard for working groups that are in formation now, as well as the marketing work I'm sharing today. In the spring of this year, DCASE worked with Choose Chicago and its ad agency, Voss Chicago, to launch a marketing campaign for the performing arts industry, theater, music, comedy, and dance. We launched it collaboratively with the League of Chicago Theaters, as well as the Chicago Latino Theater Alliance, the Chicago Independent Venue League, See Chicago Dance, and the Black Art and Culture Alliance of Chicago, among others. Go Live Chicago was a rallying cry for visitors, but especially for Chicagoans, to get off the couch and attend a live show. Here are a few creative examples. You'll see headlines like, "Your remote can't give you an encore. Your volume button can't match a crowd's roar. And when was the last time you gave a standing ovation from the couch?" The spring campaign performed well, but we made the strategic decision, also informed by our listening session and especially the new SMU DataArts report, to focus squarely on promoting theater for the fall campaign. So for this fall, there's wedding season, football season, and election season, but this fall is theater season in Chicago. The goal of this campaign is both to re-engage legacy audiences who have not yet returned to their cherished theater-going traditions, and to invite new fans to experience the magic of live performances in Chicago's many downtown and neighborhood theaters. The theater season campaign was once again creatively spearheaded by Voss Chicago, Choose Chicago's ad agency. Big kudos to them, as well as Mayor Brandon Johnson, DCASE Commissioner Erin Harkey, the League of Chicago Theaters, and so many other individuals and organizations we've been working with. Next slide. We launched the campaign just last week with some live pop-up performances at City Hall and on Daly Plaza. The pop-ups featured cast members from Hamilton, presented by Broadway in Chicago, and This Must Be the Entrance to Heaven, presented by Vision Latino Theater Company. Those activations will be followed by a more traditional campaign using these vibrant colors and headlines, urging Chicagoans and visitors to get dramatic, bring the drama, get into character, and get a front row seat this theater season. Here are some creative examples from Voss that are running through November, including social media ads you're seeing here. And on the next slide, out-of-home ads, including digital billboards along our expressways, plus radio commercials, and much more. So what's next? If you're in the Chicago area, we encourage you to keep an eye out for this campaign. We invite you to visit theaterseason.com to buy your tickets today. And if you're a Chicago theater organization, please connect with us, the League, or Choose Chicago to get involved. Next slide, please. Along with some terrific press coverage of the new SMU report, we hope this collaborative marketing work will break through and have a really positive impact. We believe the theater season campaign is powerful, a powerful call to action for locals and visitors alike. And it's just one part of the city's multifaceted efforts to uplift the creative sector. So thank you for your time and attention. Now I'll hand it back to the SMU DataArts team. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamey, Dr. Voss, and Commissioner Harkey. I'm going to switch it back to you, Zannie, as we go to our Q&A portion of our time together. And if I could just kind of kick us off with a couple of comments that we were able to collect as you were presenting the report, Zannie. One of our commenters said that that the data that you presented, it matched their experience. In-person audiences are not what they used to be pre-COVID. And on the other hand, we did add a part-time staff person last year. And so there is growth in that. And so I just wanted to give space and visibility to that comment. And there was also a comment from a cinema house that shared that they had an adequate return to audience, except not among school group audiences. And that came from Facets, and they shared that that was what they were experiencing. And so if I could kick a question off for you, there was a statistic question that you had about audiences, and they wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit on the 143% over 4-year change in total audience attendance for performance art organizations.
So what you're seeing in the 143% total attendance includes what was reported for digital attendance at, the virtual attendance at digitally disseminated programming by performing arts organizations over time. What we're seeing more broadly is that a lot of organizations, and I would be curious to hear in the chat what your experiences are, had difficulty monetizing digital programming and also had diminished staff levels coming into 2023. So all of the investments that were made in providing the digital programming, once organizations were able to open doors again, pulled back on the number of digital programs. So I'm expecting that we're going to see that decrease in 2023. There are some organizations that were able to monetize digital programming, have really made greater investments, and kind of see that as a great kind of partnering in the future for their in-person programming, and haven't necessarily seen cannibalization. But that's really not kind of the widespread experience of most organizations at this point in time. So that big increase was just what was reported being boosted by virtual attendance at digital programming.
Thank you so much for that explanation, Zannie. You shared a wonderful quote that talked about audience's truth. And so I had a question from our audience that says, does their truth include the themes and content for performance subjects? Does the audience only want to see what they believe in? And I think that's a great question for everyone on the panel.
I think we all, as spectators, as visitors, are drawn to certain kinds of programming. That is our truth. And people do vote with their feet in terms of what they value, what they're drawn to, knowing that there's a whole lot of heterogeneity, there's a whole lot of variation from person to person in terms of what kind of programming really speaks to them and what they're seeking. And that's why when we think about what's a really, really healthy arts ecology, a healthy arts ecology has lots of organizations, lots of different kinds of activity, because you think of it like ice cream. People don't want just one flavor. People like what they like. And so the more variety there is in the supply of arts and culture, the better the chances are that people are going to be able to find something that speaks to their truth and that they are drawn to. And so, welcome if either Jamey or Commissioner Harkey would want to offer any thoughts.
Well, I think we also know, it doesn't reflect so much in the data that we have, but we know from having conversations with theaters here and also theaters here, and also hearing what our executive directors and artistic directors are hearing from their colleagues around the country, that there seems to be sort of a deeper issue with theaters that are producing or developing new work as opposed to those that are doing commercially viable content, right? And I think that there is something to, the psychology of this, in that it's harder for us to get out and do something, that the surer bet there is on the other side, then the easier it is for folks to make the decision to go, right? So people are going to theater, but they're making, I think, safer bets in terms of what they are attending.
Well, thank you so much for that feedback. I wanted to make sure, Jamey, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'll agree and just say I think people are love to see themselves reflected in what arts organizations are presenting. So I think in some cases that question really hit on something important, that yeah, their truth should be reflected on stage and in the gallery, as well as you know, in all the other visitor experiences.
I will say that there, you know, two things. I sat in on AFTA's AAP6 webinar earlier today, and there's a lot packed in there with respect to public perception about arts and culture, why they attend. So I would encourage folks to go in to check it out. We also know that there are other factors that we don't necessarily think about in that mix, like distance. Distance plays a huge role in arts attendance. And during the pandemic, as we all changed our own commuting patterns about how, you know, how far something felt to go to when we weren't leaving home, we're seeing that play out in how people are purchasing now. You know, so really it's a complex equation. There are a lot of things that make up what their truth is, but certainly programming choice is one of them.
I appreciate your valuable feedback. I want to share that our comments and Q&As, they are alive. So a lot of people have really great questions. I think we only really have time for one more. So I want to share one. So it was mentioned that there are some organizations that are thriving despite the harsh conditions. And so basically, what are the lessons that maybe vulnerable organizations could learn from these organizations that are doing so well right now?
Boy, if I could bottle that up, we could all, we wouldn't have need for these kinds of analyses. I see AJ just put into the chat, but you know, what I think it comes back to is some work that we had done with Wallace Foundation on the alchemy of high-performing organizations, and across the whole spectrum of organization sizes, organization missions, types. At the very core of it was always the cornerstones of success were incredibly powerful relevance to a community orientation, and exceptionally high quality programming. It wasn't about budget size. It wasn't about, you know, a particular trait of an organization. It was having kind of great art that was really relevant to a community. And I know that that sounds like it's an easy throwaway, but when organizations got that right, that was kind of the catalyst for all of the other elements that got them on a path to long-term financial stability. I think organizations that are stable right now, in some respects, are the ones that have the answers that everyone wants to learn from. And so I would encourage organizations that are finding that they are bucking trends in certain ways to provide opportunities for them to share their stories out with peers.
Yes, I want to share that some of our org leaders are sharing some of their best practices that they've used to invite folks back into their organization. So I encourage folks to take a look at that chat and learn from your fellow colleagues. But I do want to give Commissioner Harkey and Jamey an opportunity to maybe share or answer that question as well.
I think, you know, organizations have to be willing to adapt. I think that's the most important thing. This is not, you know, a moment to like hold tightly to past ways of thinking, of doing. You know, we really have to be flexible and listen. And I think one of the things we know is that each theater is different. There's not a monolith or one thing that's happening. Every theater has a slightly different economic profile. Some people are holding, you know, large capital expenses. Some theaters are itinerant. Like there's lots of different sort of mixes to this. And so we can't prescribe right? One solution. So the theaters are really going to have to, I think, do the work to figure out what the solutions are for them. And I think that's where we as funders, right, can kind of be supportive and helping to kind of fuel organizations doing that sort of assessment. Because again, there's not one size fits all, I think, solution to what the path forward is. I'm also, I think, really excited about the things that we do not know yet, right, that will emerge in this moment. I saw something in the chat about, are newer organizations more vulnerable? That's not necessarily what we're seeing here. We're seeing some of our legacy theaters having the most challenge, right? And so I'm thinking about all of the things that in moments of stress, cultural communities rally behind to think of new models, new ways of engaging, adaptation that will ultimately, I think, increase collaboration amongst theaters and increase collaboration amongst individual creatives, and hopefully, birth the new things, that 40 years from now will be our Steppenwolfs and our Black ensemble theaters and our Looking Glasses as well. So I just want to push for imagination and experimentation in tough moments.
I really think that's a perfect way to end our Q&A portion of our webinar. And I just want to share our sincere thank you to our folks at and partners at DCASE, and to each of you for your amazing questions and comments. Our audience has really been very thoughtful in their questions, some of which we just did not have enough time to get to. There were just so many amazing questions. And so our team will try our best to collect them and provide some feedback for you and share those in our follow-up communications, which will be a recording of today's presentation along with our slides as well. So I just want to say that. And really quickly, if you can bear with me in technology, I'm going to share my screen again to share contact information for both of our organizations in the case that you would like to continue to learn more or reach out to our friends at the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. You have their QR code along with a web link and email if you would like to reach out and ask some additional questions, particularly to Jamey and his presentation about some of their strategies that they apply to their area that you could probably take to your community as well. I'll also share our DataArts. We always love to hear from you and learn more about your work, so feel free to stay connected with us as well. And with that, in our last moment, I want to say on behalf of all of our teams, thank you so much for joining us in this hour. We appreciate you listening and learning with us. Thank you to Zannie. Thank you to Commissioner Erin Harkey. Thank you to Jamey Lundblad. We appreciate our partnership with you. And with that, we're just going to hold our space for just a few more moments. I know that my team is answering some questions and sharing links, so I want to be able to provide that before we close our webinar space. But thank you so much for joining us today. With that, it looks like we're good to go ahead and close our webinar space. Thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone.